The Punjab, the breadbasket of India, was one of the places where American universities partnered under USAID funding to establish new universities of agriculture, and with it they took the American system of agricultural research centers, agricultural extension, which means teaching, transferring technology from the research centers into local communities, teaching the farmers and farmers as trainers for the next generation. We set that all up. We abandoned it in India about 15 years ago when India started to become self-sufficient. So for reasons I cannot justify, we walked away from institution building in agriculture. About the same time, we walked away from it all through South America, and we never really established it well in lots of different other parts of India. I don't see either administration, either political party in the U.S. today having the proper idea. Republicans are sort of Ron Paul's against any form of foreign aid, and on the other side, the farther left side, we say we got problems of our own. We can't afford to support anything else around the world. So we've got two sides that I believe are fighting the wrong battle. We should try to get back in what international interactions we have in developing the infrastructure, especially the agricultural structure around the world.
So politics matters.
It does matter.
All right.
I don't know how to change
Rolf,
it.
did you want to jump in right now? Or
yeah, maybe just real quick. I think it goes back to the issue of scale. And so this is a time scale this time here. So this is a slide here from the USGS showing you the Ogallala aquifer, which underlies Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Texas, and parts of Wyoming and South Dakota. The orange and red spots are those that are getting depleted. We have more than 40 feet of loss of water level there. This is very similar to the situation with oil. This is an ancient aquifer, right? It's unique. It's one of the biggest in the world, and it gets pumped down. Okay. The only difference to oil is when you have extracted the last drop of water from this, there is no simple way of making water. There's alternatives to making fuels, to make energy, because we're not interested in oil particularly. We are interested in energy storage, some energy-dense material, and we can create it. But creating water, particularly at the volumes that we need here, and it's 100. You need lots of water, as you appreciate, for growing crops and so forth. So what can you imagine how this place looks when there's no water anymore? How all these and what the land is worth and so forth. So I think it's a matter of sustainability. So I endorse the growth curves that you showed, but I think there will be. This is not a the party will not go on forever like the housing market and all the other good things. At some point it might be a bell curve, or maybe it's a catastrophe. But it will come down, and the question is, what is acceptable for humanity?
Yes.
So
speak into the microphone.
Yeah. So, I mean, it seems to me, Charlie made a lot of really important and good points. And actually, I mean, it seems I actually thought that the points, Charlie, you were making at the end about institution building were really interesting and really important. And it seems to me that appreciating that kind of thing, that these systems have histories, and that there have been intentions behind them, that there's been planning, right? And that, in a sense, ideas matter at all kinds of different levels. You can give us a much richer idea of what the market is. So, 15 years ago or whatever, when I was undergrad, I was wandering around in China. It really struck me in Beijing that I could get a bowl of the most fantastic noodles you can imagine on the street for about 10 cents. But if I went into McDonald's, a Big Mac was $4. It was the same price as in the US, right? And I mean, that was an astronomical amount to pay for a meal in Beijing, yeah? But if you wanted to impress a girl and take her to someplace really nice and really cool, you would take her to McDonald's, right? Because it was hip, it was have an American experience. And so in a sense, I mean, the notion that you have increased affluence and therefore you're going to have increased meat consumption, yeah, I mean, to some degree that's because maybe meat tastes good. But it's also because the ideas matter, right? I mean, this is when you're affluent, what you do is you eat more meat. So it seems to me that I mean, you can see ideas in markets, preferences. But I think actually a better thing to call them for purposes of this discussion is taste, right? You can see taste acting in markets on the level of individual decision making, but you can also see them at the level of institutions. I mean, agriculture is an extremely regulated market, right? There is no free market, okay? It's absurd to say that there is. There's extensive intervention in the management of agricultural markets for very good reasons. And so some of that takes place on a kind of day-to-day basis, but some of that takes place in terms of the building, the institutions, the structures, and actually the ideas, I think, that look forward. So, I mean, I think the idea of sustainability is a really interesting kind of cultural problem. So it is a technical problem. I mean, it is contending with problems like this, but it's also a problem of appreciating that problems like this are problems. And that when we imagine a future together, we want a future in which this kind of thing isn't a problem. And therefore, we make a priority and incorporate into our preferences and our habits the doing of things that are sustainable. So I mean, it seems to me that there's a lot of richness to be had in discussions of the market that tend not to be addressed, but they're there. I mean, there is that thickness, you know, that should be appreciated.
Do you want to jump in, Charlie?
Well, yeah, I appreciate your comments, but I wanted to return to Rolf. Rolf's painting gloom and doom because we're depleting the aquifers, etc. That's recent. You know, I spent a lot of time, I was a Deputy Chancellor for Agriculture in Texas. I spent a lot of time traveling up in this area. They used to grow winter wheat and sorghum through here. And winter wheat because you get the rains in the winter. You plant it in the fall, it gets rains in the winter, you get a pretty good wheat yield. And if it isn't a good wheat yield, they just turn the cattle out on the wheat in the springtime and use it in pasture instead. So they had a nice economic balance. Along came the technology for center pivot irrigation, and so they drilled a whole bunch of wells in there. What they do? They grew corn, because you can make about 4 times more per acre growing corn than you can sorghum or winter wheat. And it's reliable income, because you get it all the time because you're pumping water out here. Now they're starting to run out of water. What are they doing? They're going back to sorghum and wheat. It isn't like it's going to turn into the Sonoran Desert. It's just going to go back to what it was 30 years ago. Now, we got plenty of corn in other parts of the country. So, I know one thing these guys are making, one of the reasons, especially this part right down in here, south of Lubbock in this part of Texas, the reason they drilled wells, that's where all the oil patch was. All these farmers are making so much money on their oil revenue, had nothing to do but spend it, so they drilled holes in the ground and pumped the water out. It's just, it was crazy economics is what it was. So I know a little bit about this area up here in Kansas, but that was also wheat that turned into corn. And so we got more corn here, made the corn in Iowa less valuable, so we have to figure out some way of subsidizing farmers, so we start demanding that we put bioethanol in our cars. It's just, it's all economics. So I just want to leave the idea.
So
I, for one, don't give a damn if they run out of water out here, because they'll go back to the same sort of agriculture they did 40 years ago.
Well, there's an intrinsic problem, Charles, with corn. Corn is an extremely inefficient cultivar regarding the uptake of nutrients. And water too, but water doesn't pollute, and nitrogen and phosphate runoffs are a major reason for the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. So I think that's also part of what we have to do. If we are going to keep producing this amount of corn, we need to make sure that corn is more efficient and we waste less fertilizer. For example, here in Sonora, I guess not Sonora, almost. Here in Arizona, a head of lettuce, you need 140 liters of water to make a head of lettuce. So next time you eat the lettuce, that means that you can see the amount of, and actually Yuma is one of the main producers of this country. This is, we're in a point where that's not going to be possible anymore. I completely agree that we passed the Hoover core of the Hoover point, and I think we should start thinking on making agriculture more efficient.
So I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience. There were a lot, and I'm going to sort of group a few of them together. Considering the negative social and environmental impacts of human population growth, shouldn't we try to restrict food supply and return our population to a more sustainable level? On that same note,
You're on a diet, guys.
should there be 8 billion people in this world? Is there a limit on the number of people our planet can sustain? How do we go about this politely? Should we invade Mars? Newt wants to go to the moon, so don't forget that. And should we concern ourselves with feeding 8+ billion in the first place, or should we allow natural forces of carrying capacity to affect or limit population growth, placing our emotions aside? That's that question. So, thoughts on this?
Has anybody seen Contagion? Yeah, that's the answer. Go out and use genetic engineering to create a better virus. I mean, 25% of the world population is supposed to go in contagion.
Science doesn't tell us read the methods.
Oh, that's right. I think it's an absurd question.
It's 5 questions.
But all of them are.
I think the underlying question is, what is the carrying capacity of this planet, right? So how many people can you actually feed in eternity? And that's a good question to answer. I don't think we have all the answers, we have all the science for it. And I think it's a moving target. And as we get better with the science that Charlie and others deliver, you know, we might be able to bump that number up. But it most certainly might not be 9 billion in eternity.
I think there is probably some finite carrying capacity. But you look at where population is growing. It's in the poorest, least educated parts of the world. You look in Europe. When I was growing up, the population growth rate in Italy was astronomical. Today, Italy's in decline. It's almost any part of the world where the economy has taken off, people have what they need for their daily life. They don't need to depend upon children. I don't need to have a lot of grandchildren to support me when I'm old, because we have a social network structure. And as that gets established around the world, the pressure to have more children and grandchildren diminishes. So really what is going to, it isn't going to be food supply, it's really the economic growth that's necessary around the world to get stable societies that can support education and just go off on a tangent. When I was at a meeting at WHO in Geneva about this whole population a decade ago, and I made the statement, everybody in the world should be given a television. And it got a tremendous laugh. They thought I was joking. No, I mean, television do 2 things. Keep you occupied at night, for one thing. But mainly what they do is transmit information. Let the people see how people are living in other parts of the world. And that would be better than anything else we could possibly do.
Other thoughts? Or should we move to another set of questions? All right, we'll move to another set of questions. There's some folks who want to know more about GMOs, and in particular, the impact of GMOs on things like biodiversity, and also the impact of GMOs on our own health. Are genetically modified foods just as healthy as other kinds of foods? So some of you might want to launch in on those.
Well, so far there is no direct evidence that there is any GMO food that has actually affected human health.
In a bad way.
In a bad way.
In a bad way, yes. I mean, there are cases of people that have eaten, I think, oil from canola that was genetically modified to produce some lipids that come from peanuts, and of course they were allergic to peanuts to start with, and they had problems with that. But that's actually as far as dramatic as it has get. On the other hand, biodiversity, well, monocultures affect biodiversity, but one thing that we forget is that we were kicked out from the Garden of Eden a long time ago. So we live in a world that needs huge extensions to produce food for cities like this one that wouldn't be able to be sustained by organic or house garden agriculture. So it's a necessary evil, but that's the way we have chosen long time ago, and I don't think there's a way back, especially with the amount of people we have. What we can do, and we should try to do, is to do this monoculture or big agriculture less damaging and more sustainable. I think that answer is yes, we can. And I think GMOs can play an important role in it.
I think that it's not an easy question. So people like black and white, answers, particularly in this, time of year or the elections approaching. But you won't get it for this type of complex question. So the issue is, you can also point, and Charlie did that, to point to crops, naturally occurring crops, that if put into place, they are the worst stuff that you could put into place. And the same, I believe, applies to genetically engineered materials. There are some plants, some crops that you might not want to use, and there might be others that you could, but you need to make a prudent decision. And who makes that decision, on what basis, that is the key. It's not really about whether it's GMO or not, but it's about on what basis is the decision reached, or whether this is the right crop to grow for your country and the rest of the world.
Charlie, this one here?
The one Clive James one. If anybody wants to just see what crops we grow, go to ISAAA.org in Google. There's 1 billion acres now grown around the world. There's 29 countries that grow genetically engineered crops. They're growing, the growth is going up very rapidly, 87-fold increase in number of hectares between 2006 and 2010, etc. It goes on and on. We get an incredible amount of controversy over a very small number of crop species. It's corn and soybeans, cotton, canola. Think of it, there's what is it in Hawaii? The papaya, virus-resistant papaya, in about 30 square miles in Hawaii.
And rapeseed.
Pardon?
Rapeseed.
Yeah, or canola or rapeseed. Yeah, yeah. So there's a small number of crops. Why is it only this? Why isn't it strawberries or tomatoes or other things? It's by and large because these are the big commodity crops that for which farmers will pay to buy seed if they get an added value. In corn, what farmers are paying a premium on the, well, it's very hard not to get genetically modified corn in the U.S., but they pay the extra price because they get insurance essentially on their yield. They get insect resistance, so they don't get a crop loss if there's a major outbreak of insects. They get herbicide tolerance, so they can use a cheap, environmentally safe herbicide. And, well, corn, the rest is all insecticides. It's earworm, rootworm, etc. that has been put into the corn crop. So farmers will pay more for the seed because they get a return. I worked for DuPont for a while in my career, 4 years of my career. I understand pricing of things that are sold to farmers. You can charge 20 cents on the dollar if a farmer is confident that he's going to get 40 cents in return. In other words, or 60 cents in return. In other words, he'll pay $1 to get $3 back. And farmers are very smart people. Through experience, they're figuring out where they should put the value into the products that they purchase to plant in their fields. So big companies roughly charge 1/3 of the value that they're going to give to the farmer in anything. That's pretty much the whole way the pricing structure has been for all the genetically engineered corn and soybeans and canola. And what farmers get is a better guarantee of yield in their crops without the year-to-year oscillation in yield loss due to weeds or insects. Oh, another one, cotton. I didn't say cotton. And the other major crop is cotton. And that's entirely because of insect costs. I don't know how many of you were here in Arizona 12 years, 15 years ago. if you used to drive out to the east end of the valley, if you go past Mesa out to what's now Apache Junction and out around the ASU East campus, that was all cotton fields. I moved here 10 years ago. As I drove out to the Polytech, well, it wasn't Polytech then, but what's now the Polytech campus, every day in the springtime, you'd see airplanes, small airplanes in there, spraying pesticides over that area, constantly, because this is one of the worst areas in the country for cotton bollworm. Yeah, but there's another. Anyway, it's a larvae of an insect that eats the cotton bolls. Why did they spend so much money to put insecticides? Because we were making, Arizona was growing long staple Pima cotton, which is the highest value return cotton. So if you get something harvested here in long staple Pima, you're going to get top value in the marketplace. So they put a bunch of money into constantly flying planes and applying insecticides. You go out there, there's still cotton, not as much. You got to go south of Phoenix, not find cotton fields. You go out there any time of the week and look for a spray plane. There isn't a one. Now, all the spray operators have gone out of business in Arizona for one simple reason: because there's BT cotton. The insecticide is built into the cotton plant, genetically built in, so you don't have to apply insecticides. Farmers pay more for that cotton seed, and they pay a lot more. I mean, if you just went on a bag of seed, you're paying 10 times as much money for a bag of seed as if they took the old seed. So you say, they're being ripped off. Man, 10 times more for seed. But their insecticide costs, which were much greater, have dropped to maybe 10%. They have to go in and do touch-up spray. Any cotton farmers in, children of cotton farmers in here? If there is, just tell me if I'm off on any of my general numbers, but I doubt I am. So farmers are making money on genetically engineered crops. That's why they do it. Oh, you have cottonseed oil, it goes into your food supply. So in your salad dressing, you're getting genetically engineered cottonseed oil. Well, you don't engineer the cottonseed, you just got protein in there. It'll never show up in your cottonseed oil or your salad dressing. So is that dangerous to you? You know, like you said, there has never been any documented evidence of a negative health effect of any of the crops that have been legitimately introduced. I think all that we see growing are legitimately introduced, and they're approved by the FDA, the USDA, and the EPA in this country before the seed can be sold. So
and at the same time, it could very well be the case that things like corn, whether it's genetically modified or not, just isn't good for you in the first place. Certainly not in the ways that it gets into our bodies, but
certainly, most of it's going into high fructose corn syrup. I mean, for the food supply, it goes into high fructose corn syrup to go into your Coca-Cola, so you're drinking, 40 grams of sugar every time you have a Coke. That's bad for you. It's just straight out bad. So,
all right, so we did have a question about that, but I want to sort of bring things to an end because I gather we're supposed to end 10 minutes ago. Is that right? We can keep going, you mean? All right, well, I'm going to ask this one question real quickly because it follows along what Charlie was just saying. So it's a long question. Last September, the United Nations announced that non-communicable diseases, specifically diabetes, cancer, and heart disease, now pose a greater health burden worldwide than infectious disease. In the U.S., 75% of healthcare dollars are spent treating these kinds of diseases and their associated disabilities. Today, Nature published an article called Public Health, The Toxic Truth About Sugar, that recommended that the FDA regulate sugar in some of the same ways that alcohol and tobacco are regulated. For example, making restaurants and fast food menus clearly label caloric content and other kinds of things. So in terms of governance moving forward, the question was, do you think the FDA should implement such regulatory measures in the interests of public health? Any thoughts from anybody on the panel in that regard?
I think they should educate people.
well, did Prohibition, when it came in back in the 30s, did that stop people from using alcohol? It's just, people use sugar because they love the way it tastes. I mean, it is an education issue, but
I think it's not the amount of, it's the quality of sugar used. And very often it's education. It's just if you're giving sweets to kids, just to get rid of them, or even if you, I mean, it has a social component. Because I think people that have low resources, they also, for them it's easier to go to fast food places.
Let me,
The quality of that
Tony,
source.
let me chime in here.
Yeah.
So really, Americans, I think, like information. What's wrong with information? Just put the information on the food you buy. Let us know how much sugar is in there. Let us know whether it's genetically modified or not. And let the people decide whether they like that or not. Right now, they can't make choices. You can't make choices about things you don't know about. If you go to a restaurant, you don't know where the food is coming from. As we say, there's nothing wrong necessarily with genetically modified foods. But if you have ethical considerations about your food choices, whatever they are, whether it's meat or plants or other things, you know, give yourself the opportunity to aspire, you know, assimilate that information and then use it.
But well, we do have nutritional labeling on all foods, not in restaurants, although it's now required in, you know, places like McDonald's and others. It's posted on the wall, no one looks at it, but it's posted. But every other thing we buy, including our cans of Coca-Cola, it's required to show how much sodium, how much cholesterol, how much sugar it has. Whoever looks at it, it's sort of information overload that no one pays any attention to. And let me tell you, just are sort of touching on this whole issue that we should label whether the food is genetically modified. We've gone through the test of this with BST, bovine somatotropin, in milk. This is, a lot of you probably don't even remember this, because this is really about 15, 20 years ago that this was really the hot button. In part because Monsanto was one of the first to begin selling bovine somatotropin. It's growth hormone. Step back a little bit further. Growth hormone was discovered because dwarfism was a rare but still prevalent genetic defect in the human population. When I was young, which was a long time ago, I remember going to the circus, and every circus had a tent where you'd go and see the dwarfs. You'd see the fat lady and the dwarfs. That was just part of circus life. You would see small people in large cities all the time. You don't see that anymore. And why is that? Because we discovered human growth hormone, and children who are genetically defined early in their life get growth hormone, and so we don't have dwarfism, at least in the developing world at the present time. Now, clever, creative people said, well, other animals must have growth hormone equivalent, and it was discovered by agriculturists. The early work was at the University of Wisconsin, that bovine somatotropin is very similar to human somatotropin, or human growth hormone. And they tested it in cattle, and it didn't make full-grown cattle grow any bigger, but what it did was, in lactating females, caused them to give more milk. The feed conversion ratio is influenced by growth hormone. In other words, if a cow eats a bale of hay a day without hormone, she'll give some amount, let's say 25 liters of milk. With bovine somatotropin, and it's injected, it's an intramuscular injection, just like you can do with people, that will go up to something 30 to 32 liters of milk for that cow. Now you're a farmer, and you're sitting thinking about this, and you say, oh, that extra 7 liters of milk per cow per day with no extra food consumption is going to give me whatever the value of 7 liters of milk is, but let's say $3. Along comes Monsanto and they say, well, we'll sell you a month's supply of somatotropin for $8. And you sit back and 30 times that, and you run the numbers and you say, hey, I can make money on this. And so farmers started buying bovine somatotropin, and it's one of the reasons we have a glut in the milk market in the U.S. today. And we had to do things subsequently to buy farmers out and get them out of the business because they got way too much milk. Political problems galore. Anyway, so one of the things that people protested was, we shouldn't be selling this milk because it could have growth hormone in the milk. And then you start thinking, oh my God, it's going to affect people, they're going to get distorted or bigger or something. So the Food and Drug Administration required that the milk be evaluated to see if it's chemically different between the two cows, with and without bovine somatotropin. No one, and you can go back and look at the literature, lots of scientific groups, the government groups, etc., tried to find difference in the two milk. You can't find it. The milk is virtually identical. And that's not the key point here is, but there were folks that said all milk which comes from cows which have received recombinant bovine somatotropin, that milk should say on the label, DST, this milk came from DST treated cows. And then you could make this decision. You could say, I don't want any of that genetically engineered milk. Well, why didn't we do it? There's a lot of political will to do it. But we're also a legal nation. And FDA, Food and Drug Administration, pointed out, they said, yeah, you put that regulation on that everyone has to label where the milk comes from, but you have to have a means of enforcing that rule. What's going to be your means of enforcement? You have to rule out that you can tell any difference by sampling the milk itself. So you can't go to the end product. You got to trace it back to the farmer. So what we'd have to do is have a police force in place that would check periodically, maybe once a week, every dairy farmer in the country, search his kitchen to make sure he hasn't stocked up on some bovine somatotropin, and logic prevailed, as it usually does in this country. And they said, this is unenforceable, therefore, ergo, we are not going to require labeling. I still go into grocery stores today, and you will see lots of the milk things saying, this comes from cows that have not been treated with bovine somatotropin. Now, a lot of us see that in Arizona. I frankly think this is clever marketing, but it's probably untrue. It means we've got a whole bunch of stupid dairy farmers out here in Arizona, and I've met a lot of these dairy farmers, and they are not stupid. So,
really quick.
Rolf, and then Ben, and then Roberto, and then Marci, and then Goodnight.
So, Charlie, Duck, these are two questions they're going to ask. First of all, if nobody reads the label, why not put it up? Because it can do no harm. So let's do that for GM and see whether it changes anything. And secondly, since labeling is not important for the next election, please block out all the names and just place your cross.
So I think that when we talk about information, giving information to consumers, it's important to ask what that information is information about. Because in giving information, we're kind of making a guess. We're imagining what that information might mean to the person who's consuming it, right? The FDA puts a lot of time and consults focus groups all the time to understand what people are thinking when they read fresh on their spaghetti sauce label, whatever. FDA effectively is a regulator of the dissemination of information. That's basically what FDA does, and that was FDA's mandate from its inception. So, I mean, I think the BST example is a really interesting example because there was a deep fight. There was a big fight about this, and the concern was that if this information, so apart from the enforcement issue, if this information was given to consumers, consumers might think that it meant something, that there was a difference between milk with BST and milk without, produced with it or without it. And the notion was clearly there isn't because we've demonstrated that they're effectively equivalent materials, and ergo. But those who wanted it labeled and who ultimately sort of got this compromised position where you can have it labeled, but then there's an asterisk and it says FDA, look at your milk. It says FDA has found that there's no difference whatsoever, and this information should be totally irrelevant to you if you're rational. What the people who wanted labeling wanted was not necessarily to let consumers know that there might be something dangerous in here, but that their milk came from a cow that had a higher risk of mastitis, right? That was made into a higher producer to produce more milk than that cow was sort of built to produce. Okay, I mean, this was the notion that this was what. So that in buying non-BST milk, you're buying a way of making milk, as opposed to a particular material that may or may not have something in it. Okay, I think the same exact thing can be said about the organic, non-organic distinction in the U.S. That distinction, incidentally, one of the big questions when USDA initially put out the rules in 1997. In 97, the rules that USDA proposed were that there would be, that organic could include genetically modified. And there was a massive response. USDA got something like 20 times more public comments than it had ever gotten on an advanced notice proposed rulemaking in its history. And many of those comments said, we don't want genetic modification under the organic label because it violates what the project of organic is about, right? Well, in a sense, this is illogical because there is no way to keep the organic field separate from the genetically modified field because the wind doesn't die and the bee doesn't hit the U-turn, et cetera, right? And it's been shown lots of times that the non-genetically modified is contaminated with the genetically modified. Both the sort of mainstream agricultural industry and the kind of environmental lobby and pro-organic communities wanted to draw this demarcation and thought it was a reasonable demarcation to draw. What was that a demarcation about? It wasn't really about what's in the matter that you're putting in your mouth, so much as the idea behind the way that matter should be generated. And I think that's really important. I mean, it's an important thing to appreciate. And I mean, so you look at that from the consumer level. What does this information mean? That's a complicated question. Look at it also from the regulatory level. So we in this country regulate products, right? So FDA asks the question: is this genetically modified tomato different or the same as this conventionally produced tomato, corn? This one will be right. So a substantial equivalency, right? In Europe, they regulate process. So the question is, how did you make it? Not what's in it when you grind it up, but how did you make it? And there are pluses and minuses to both forms of regulation. You can have an argument about it that Europeans are not complete idiots, and neither are we. Have ultimate answers to everything. But the point is that the kind of information that you give and the way you expect that what the meanings you anticipate that information having also connects back to a much bigger sort of system of governance in which we make decisions about what kind of questions are we going to ask, who's going to make these judgments, and most importantly, in what ways do we anticipate a public trusting these judgments, right? Because when a drug says FDA approved or a device says FDA approved, or for that matter, our spinach is FDA or USDA approved, we basically trust FDA rather than trust the spinach. You see what I'm saying? So that information entails a relationship between a system of governance and the people who are acting on the basis of what that system tells them. And that is a culturally complex system that does not come down to the molecular composition of a given material.
Final thoughts from Roberto and Marci.
Well, I think that these kinds of meetings are very good for us, for everybody, because we learn. And that's basically what can make us take the right decisions. If we learn, we hear questions, we see different points of view, we learn from each other, we should be able to take more intelligent decisions. I just want to make my last comment. GMOs are not Frankenflakes. GMOs might actually be more ecological friendly than a lot of very published organic compounds or organic farming systems. So it's just when you read in the web about GMOs, always scrutinize information. Because if you read in the web, you're going to find that they generate cancer. So if it says generate cancer, well, trace the papers and see if there is any scientific information in that regard. Lies are there, so we have to be aware and not demonize something. Why is someone trying to demonize this technology? That I don't know. But it's not the panacea, but I think so far is the more intelligent or more, well, not intelligent, but the better equipped method we have to improve crops.
Marci, it's all on you.
Okay, so going back to the original question about public health and sugar, should it be regulated?
You can always count on a student to get it right back on track, right? These professors. Go ahead, Marci.
I forgot that question.
I don't know if it should be regulated. Will it be regulated? I actually don't think it will ever be regulated because the power of food lobbyists is incredibly powerful in Washington. So when you look at just how the food pyramid is constructed, it's not just constructed by a panel of experts, it's constructed by a panel of experts with like thousands of lobbyists and millions of dollars coming at them from every angle. So that's something to keep in mind. But I also think that this brings up sort of a class issue of to what extent can we regulate people's behavior? Specifically, we've been talking a lot about poor people or people on the other side of the world or people who maybe, you know, don't know what's right for them. It's sort of like some of the things that's in the air. And I think that that's a really important question. And the thing is that low-income people, they want to eat healthy too. They're aware of what they're eating and they're aware of what they should be eating, but these options aren't always available to them. And so one of the interesting things that I read about recently was potato chips. So we think of potato chips as like the ultimate like unhealthy food, but when's the last time you went down Whole Foods and saw how many potato chips there are? There's like a ton of them. They're like gluten-free, organic, low sodium, all natural. I mean, for some reason, these Whole Food potato chips, we sort of think of as like better for us. And so I just want to sort of point out the irony and that there's like even a sort of class divide in potato chips and the GMO-free, gluten-free ones versus like Lay's potato chips. So to what extent should we be thinking about regulating people's behavior, or should we be providing healthy, cheaper, and convenient options? I think that should be the real question here.
Thanks, everyone, and I hope you'll join me in thanking these five. You can go to the Facebook page, facebook.com/feed8zillion,
Took a smidge longer than I thought.
and the SciTech Fest folks want your input. Thanks, everyone.
Seriously recording this on the phone?